There could be additional charges down the line, but for now, Abigail Ruth Davis, I'm arresting you on suspicion of attempting to liquidate Samantha Lloyd Smith. You have the right to remain silent. With that, my wife collapsed. If I'd acted more quickly, I might have been able to catch her before she hit the floor, but I thought the fall wouldn't be as bad as the blow she had tried to land on Sammy, so I only made a half-hearted attempt to catch her, which, of course, failed. Before I continue, let me give you some background on the key players in this story. I'm Robert Robbie Davis, an accountant, though not the type you'd expect. I grew up in a rough neighborhood where most people ended up in jail or worked in factories. I got lucky. I started out at a carpet factory where it didn't take long for me to break every machine I touched, so they moved me to the warehouse. Over time, my ability to organize and handle numbers caught the eye of the owner, Griffin Lloyd, who promoted me to the control room. For reasons I can't quite explain, I decided to take an accounting course at a local college and, to my surprise, excelled at it. Impressed by my skills, Lloyd moved me to the head office and supported me in becoming a certified accountant. That's when I first met his daughter, Samantha. To be blunt, we didn't hit it off. Samantha wasn't anything like her hardworking father. She was a spoiled princess, constantly pushed up the social ladder by her ambitious mother. Beautiful, in a way that made every man at the office stop what they were doing and stare. And she knew it. She was a classic tease. A few years later, she married Gerald Smythe, a guy just as self-absorbed as she was. He saw himself as the world's greatest gift, and she was the woman who wanted the wealth and status that came with him. They were a perfect match. Now, let me tell you about Abigail Ruth Marley. She worked at the factory running machines that rewound yarn onto cones for the looms. Like me, she came from the same tough neighborhood, but unlike me, she never bothered with school. Abby believed her beauty and charm were enough to pull her out of her rough life, and it was clear she had her sights set on me. I wasn't totally naive, but Abby was hard to resist. At 22, she was stunning. Jet black hair cropped short, giving her a boyish look that somehow enhanced her femininity. Her liquid brown eyes were full of desire, and her slender body had curves in all the right places. At that time, the company was fulfilling a huge contract to supply green carpets to the Ministry of Defense. The deadline was tight, so overtime was abundant, and the machines ran nonstop, often until midnight. As a key employee, I had to pick up extra shifts, especially since Samantha couldn't let go of her social life and the boss was already sick. It was early December, and the snow had begun falling, something rare for our area. No one was prepared for it, and the roads were getting slick. As I left the factory that night, I saw Abby standing alone at the bus stop. I pulled over and asked if she was okay. She told me her ride had backed out because her sister wasn't a good driver in the snow. I knew her sister's car, a Mandio's, and figured it was a dangerous ride in these conditions. So I offered her a ride. She appreciated it, and to help keep her warm, I let her use my cell phone to call her sister. We talked the whole way, and she told me the foreman had agreed to transfer her to a new role after the holidays. I flirted a little, telling her someone as beautiful as her should aim higher than a job like that, and she laughed. I enjoyed her company during the half-hour drive. When we got to her place, she invited me in for coffee. I politely declined, but then she kissed me. And it wasn't just any kiss. If I'd been standing on air, that kiss would have knocked me off my feet. She knew exactly what she was doing, too. Her smile as she climbed out of the car made that clear. I didn't sleep well that night. Over the years, I'd had chances to get involved with women at work, but I always kept my distance. Abby was different. By the time the last day before the holidays rolled around, we were dancing together at the factory Christmas party. Under the mistletoe, Samantha kissed me and whispered, "Be careful. She's after you. You might find something better." Shortly after, Abby came back to the party, stayed until I was closing up the factory, then mentioned she had left her flat shoes in storage. She asked me to walk her there, and I did. We strolled through the rows of carpet rolls until we reached a stack of small rugs. As she'd said, her shoes were in a bag. Being the gentleman I was, I bent down to pick them up, and when I stood back up, she was standing very close, holding a sprig of mistletoe. The kiss that followed was even more passionate than the first. If I had to sum it up in a few words, I'd say it knocked my socks off, but it was a plea. So I'll indulge myself a little. She wrapped her arms around my neck, stood on tiptoe to reach me, and our lips met. There wasn't much in the way of foreplay, but I did hear her murmur, "That feels good," before we kissed again. We ended up on a small pile of carpets, kissing passionately. The sex was great, and it seemed to last forever. Eventually, I was exhausted, so much so that she pushed me aside and reached for some tissues in her bag. As she dried herself, she looked at me and said, "Do you know how much these rugs cost?" I grinned. "I'm an accountant." She laughed, finished cleaning up, and then hugged me tightly. "That was fast," she said. "Sorry," I replied, but she kissed me again. "Don't worry, it was flattering. But if you want to make it up to me, I won't mind. Just not here, okay?" I asked, "Where do you want to go?" Completely unaware that those 4 words were about to seal my fate. She thought for a moment before answering, "I don't know. It's not going to be much fun at my place. Mom and Dad are busy packing for Christmas at Aunt Norma's, and my sister and her boyfriend are probably in the bedroom." Without thinking, I said, "What about my place?" And that, I didn't realize, was the moment I stepped into the trap. I took Abby to my place, a decent apartment with 2 bedrooms and a beautiful view of the sea. She was impressed. After a shower and a few hours of making up for my rushed mistake at the factory, she wanted to inspect everything. You know how someone inspects a place they're thinking of buying? That's how she was. She'd already complimented the bathroom, which was massive compared to the old Soviet-style ones. She couldn't stop giggling when I explained the bidet, since she'd never seen one. She loved the wardrobes and storage space in the bedroom, and she went crazy over the kitchen even though I rarely used it. She said that having a kitchen like that was one of her goals. But it was the living room view that really got her. I probably took it for granted, but her reaction reminded me of the first time I saw it. The whole bay stretching out in front of us. I probably said something cheesy about how the view was even better with her here, and she hugged me, thanking me. We were back in bed soon after. The next morning, Christmas Eve, we woke up to a beautiful frost covering the ground. After another satisfying session in bed, she insisted on making breakfast, proving she really knew her way around the kitchen. We sat down at the table, and the conversation quickly shifted to our plans for the next day. I planned to have a quiet day, reheating leftovers, watching TV, and maybe browsing the internet. She had a choice between watching TV or dealing with her sister being noisy in the next room. It seemed reasonable to make better plans, so I dropped her off at her place to pack a few things, while I went to the supermarket to buy everything she wanted for a proper lunch. It felt a little manipulative, but I didn't mind. We ended up having a wonderful holiday together. Later, we went to the carol service in the town square with a bag of roasted chestnuts, eating them on our way home. On Christmas Day, we spent the day in bed, and later I took her to the local flying club. I told her I needed the adrenaline from skydiving to break up the monotony of my work week. She had serious doubts about it, but decided to go along with it. By early February, she had done her first solo jump. Over the next month, she did a few more. And by March, she jumped alone for the first time. When she landed, I proposed. Yes, it was sentimental, and maybe a little corny, but it felt right. Just as I did, Gerald Smythe interrupted with a remark about working-class kids marrying their own kind. Without thinking, I punched him in the stomach. He dropped to his knees, winded and stunned, then promptly vomited all over the grass. Samantha, annoyed, turned to me and explained Gerald had been drinking. She quickly left, and our engagement felt somewhat tainted, but we pushed through it and were married a couple of months later. After the honeymoon, Abby decided to leave her job at the factory and found one at a recruitment agency just a few minutes from our place. Though she never valued education much, she adapted well to office life and looked great at the front desk. Things were good. We weren't rich, but we lived comfortably. Abby was a fantastic wife, great cook, inventive in bed, and a pro at taking care of the house. Our shared passion for skydiving was a bit of an expensive hobby, but we managed. Still, there were a few tensions. Abby's love of new clothes sometimes went too far, and we'd argue over it. Most of the time I gave in, but sometimes I had to hold my ground. Work had gotten tense since Griffin Lloyd's passing. Gerald tried to flex his muscles, but he only held a small portion of the company's shares. Samantha, who owned most of the company, made it clear that firing me was not an option. She told everyone at the board meeting that I was the one who truly understood the business. Gerald's plans fell apart quickly. Later, though, I overheard him in a conversation with Samantha. He said some disgusting things about her and me. I didn't stay to listen, but it left me uneasy. I told Abby about the board meeting, but before I could mention what Gerald said, Abby cut me off. "Watch out for that arrogant witch," she warned, saying she knew Samantha had always had a thing for me. I jokingly asked if she was open to a ménage à trois, which nearly got me liquidated, until Abby burst out laughing, calling me a pig. Things seemed fine at that point. I had a decent, stable job, a loving wife, and a bit of attention from a beautiful, wealthy woman. My life was comfortable, and I was still deeply in love with Abby. But things slowly started going wrong. The first sign came when Abby suddenly lost interest in skydiving. It wasn't gradual, it was like someone flipped a switch. We'd been having great weather, plenty of opportunities to jump, but she started insisting that the risks were much higher for women. She stopped jumping altogether after a final tandem jump on her birthday, just a couple of months after our first anniversary. For a while, she'd come to watch, but eventually she said that watching was worse than doing it, so she stopped. I was ready to quit, but she insisted I keep going if it made me happy. That was when Samantha started coming to watch instead of Abby. Abby didn't seem concerned, and I continued jumping, with Samantha as my new partner. Something had changed, and I didn't know what, but it was clear things weren't the same. By then, Samantha and I were getting along great. She'd changed a lot since I first met her. No longer the arrogant snob, but a solid businesswoman and a fun person to hang out with. We laughed a lot, enjoyed each other's company, and became close friends. But did I like her? Yes, still. Did she like me? I was pretty sure. But were either of us willing to act on it? No. Anyway, we talked often and trusted each other. That's why, one Sunday afternoon, while enjoying the calm air currents instead of falling toward the ground, I couldn't understand why she seemed so down. Later, we sat in a small club, sipping cold drinks, and I tried to figure out what was bothering her. At first, she denied anything was wrong, but after some prodding, she finally said, "Okay, Robbie, what would you do if you thought your partner was cheating?" I was taken aback. "What do you mean?" "I think Gerald might be having an affair." "Seriously?" I asked, shocked and unsure if I wanted to get into this. "Yeah, seriously," she said, offering a strained smile. "I need someone I can trust," she added. I hesitated. "Well, there aren't many people I'd trust with something like that either." "No, I'm serious. Everyone at work is intimidated by me, and lately I've grown disillusioned with my social circle. Most women would turn to their mothers, but let's not go there. Her mother, I knew, only cared about status, having pushed for her to marry Gerald because of his family's money. I simply nodded. "You're one of the few who treated me how I deserved, Robbie," she said. "When I was difficult at work, you were the only one who put me in my place. You don't take nonsense and you don't gossip. I trust you, probably more than anyone else." I was flattered, though it seemed like she was getting emotional. "I'm your friend, Sammy. I wouldn't have said this before, but you've changed. If there's anything I can do, you know I'll help." She looked at me, her voice shaky. "Promise me you won't tell anyone what I'm about to say, Robbie. Even Abby?" I thought about it. I'm not one for secrets, but I figured it wouldn't hurt to keep this between us. "I promise," I said, and she began speaking quietly. "You probably know things aren't great between me and Gerald. We haven't been happy for a while," she said. Honestly, I hadn't noticed. I hated Gerald and assumed he was just a fraud, but I wasn't one to meddle in other people's relationships. She continued, "At first everything seemed fine. My dad never liked him, but my mom thought he was perfect. She was wrong, he was broke when we married. He spun some story about bad investments and dishonest partners. I believed it, I was naive. It didn't take Dad long to see through him," she went on. "He gave Gerald easy tasks, paying him more than they were worth. But he also warned me not to let him waste what Dad earned. By the end of our first year, I learned Gerald was having an affair. I didn't tell you, but I found out through your notes. You remember when you questioned his spending? You were right, and that scared him enough to drop her." I had no idea, but she continued. "After that, there were others. And Gerald stopped using the company account to fund his affairs. When I confronted him about it, he claimed it was all part of his job in sales." "It was a fake position," I said. "Exactly. My dad only gave it to him to make him look useful. It was Freddie Watson who brought in most of the business." She paused, her voice faltering, as if tears were threatening to fall. "So why did you put up with it all?" I asked gently. "Partly because of my mom," she replied. "And after a big fight, we started sleeping in separate rooms. But it was clear that his affairs didn't matter much, except now this one is different." "Why?" I asked, already sensing the gravity in her voice. "It started when he became obsessed with the computer. I found it full of password-protected files, and my suspicion grew. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but I had a friend hack it for me. When she gave me the passwords, I discovered hundreds of emails between Gerald and someone called Mrs. Houghtonwit." I shuddered. "What did they say?" "They were full of declarations of love, and then things got more explicit. But the worst part is, they've been planning something." She kept mentioning how they'd both be free soon and how they had a plan to get rid of me and her husband. I'm terrified, Robbie. I think they want to ruin us both. Why not go to the police? I asked. Because they'd just call it a game, maybe say it was nothing. There's no direct threat to me, at least not yet. Do you know who she is? I pressed. No idea, she said, shaking her head. I thought it might be one of the girls from the hospice fundraiser, but it's not her. This woman can't spell and always confuses certain words. Whoever she is, she's definitely not someone Gerald's been careless with. That's when others joined us, and the conversation shifted. I had to leave soon after, and as I said goodbye, I could tell Sammy knew I was talking to her. I drove home, lost in thought. If I hadn't promised Samantha, I might have told Abby everything. But truthfully, Abby and I were already going through a rough patch in our relationship. After our first few months together, I discovered a few things about her that bothered me. At first, Abby's flirting didn't bother me too much. It was harmless. She didn't even try. Men were just drawn to her. With one look from her warm brown eyes, they'd turn into puppy dogs. She'd always introduce me as her husband, keeping me involved in the conversation. Still, it made me uneasy, especially when they glance at me with that "too bad you're here" look. We talked about it a few times, and she always said the same thing. It's nothing, Robbie. They're just flirting. I don't encourage them. Do you want me to be rude? I don't show too much skin, and I dress modestly. Should I wear a burqa next time? I accepted it for a while. It settled down, but one day it flared up again. My car was in the shop, and Abby came to pick me up from work. If I'd been in my office, I wouldn't have seen her park. But I was in Freddie Watson's office, negotiating a contract, and I saw her pull up outside. She got out of her Mazda MX-5, and 3 guys she used to work with approached her. A friendly kiss on the cheek would have been normal, but these guys were way too familiar. Each of them gave her a long, lingering kiss on the lips, even one who rubbed against her. I quickly finished with Freddie, raced downstairs, and saw her park in my spot. I kept my cool. I didn't react immediately, but on the way home, I casually asked, "Just got here?" When she said yes, I told her what I saw. She froze. She tried to brush it off, but I snapped, the first time she'd seen me lose my temper. "I don't care who they are," I shouted. "If I ever see you act like that with anyone again, you'll be out the door, back to your parents, before you can even get your tongue out of his mouth, okay?" It was a tough night with a lot of tears, but I made it clear that I meant what I said. The second issue was in the bedroom. Early on, things were great, new and exciting, exploring each other. But over time, Abby started wanting more. We bought an adult toy online, and she loved it. A few weeks later, she ordered a bigger one, which became part of our routine. I suspected she used it when I wasn't around. Then, she started reading explicit stories online, which at first were just normal couples' fantasies. But soon the stories shifted to infidelity and open relationships. I wasn't comfortable with it, but she insisted they were just stories, nothing more. Eventually, she confessed that they turned her on, and I accepted that. After all, I had my own fantasies too. But then, things got weird. She started pushing, asking if I'd ever want to watch her with someone else or swap partners. I wasn't into it, and when I told her to stop reading those stories, she seemed to get the message. But that didn't stop her. She started buying even more toys and lingerie. She said it was to keep things exciting, so I'd never want an affair. I reluctantly played along, but it felt forced. I tried, but my heart wasn't in it. Then one night, she came to me wearing a leather corset, stockings, boots, with a whip and handcuffs in hand. She said, "I'm going to chain you up and give you unforgettable pleasure." I just said no. She kept pushing, but I wasn't having it. I told her I was hungry and went downstairs to order pizza. She screamed at me, calling me controlling, boring, and unadventurous. It became a recurring issue. Whenever we tried to talk about it, it ended the same way. She'd tell me to take what I wanted while she lay back, and I'd just tell her, maybe next time. Despite the passion, I felt something was off. As time went on, I realized if things didn't change, it might be best for both of us to call it quits. I still loved her, but I wasn't sure how much longer we could keep going like this. One evening, Abby was out visiting her mom, so I had some time to think. I thought about what Samantha had told me and felt more certain that we needed to do something. I decided it was time for Abby to call the police about her concerns with Gerald, at least to document everything. When I got home, Abby was gone. She'd gone out drinking with her sister. I heated up some food and called her. She was at the pub, and I warned her not to drive. After we hung up, I decided to kill some time on her laptop as mine was still in the car. I browsed for sports scores, then noticed a folder labeled Miscellaneous. Inside, there were hundreds of files, and I started scrolling through them. Something about it didn't sit right, but I couldn't shake the feeling something was off. I had opened that folder before and knew it contained a mix of random things, old photos, unfinished stories she'd started but never finished, and some downloaded content from her favorite adult site. I started checking it more often, trying to figure out what she was reading, thinking it might help me understand where her head was at. The newest files showed she'd been reading a lot of hardcore Zex stories, along with a significant amount of loving wife tales. When I checked, most of these were about cheating wives and betrayed mans. I sighed, feeling frustrated because none of this was helping her deal with our issues. But then I found something completely out of place, a folder labeled System Information. Curious, I opened it. Inside were several subfolders, and one had a warning that opening it could damage the computer. Anyone with half a brain could tell that was a fake warning, and it turned out to be just that. A few more clicks, and I found a password-protected email link. After a brief moment of hesitation, I typed in Mrs. and Wet, and it opened. What I found was mostly inappropriate photos, some she'd taken, some I'd been persuaded to take. I didn't linger on them. I deleted everything, not wanting to waste any more time, then heard my phone ring. I shut down the computer and left to pick her up from the pub. When I got there, I found out that Joe, one of Abby's friends, had just completed his solo jump. Something went terribly wrong during his descent. He screamed as he fell, and then there was a terrible silence, an eerie, complete silence before we all heard the sickening thud of his body hitting the ground. The ambulance arrived, but my first thought was that it had to have been a fatal fall. If he survived, he'd be in horrible shape. Joe had been talking to Samantha and me just before the jump, and though he showed more respect for her than for me, at that moment, it didn't matter. I knew what had happened. Joe had experienced a horseshoe malfunction, a rare, deadly problem in skydiving where the parachute gets tangled and fails to deploy properly. I'd seen it happen before, but never with such disastrous consequences. I couldn't help but feel sick as I stood there, watching the ambulance rush to the scene. Samantha, who had lent Joe her parachute, was beside herself. She collapsed into my arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "It could have been me," she whispered through her tears. I just held her tighter, trying to comfort her, even though I felt as helpless as she did. Detective Mark Haley, an old friend of mine, showed up soon after. He was one of the few people from the old neighborhood who hadn't fallen into bad habits, and like me, he was part of the parachute club. He asked me who the jumper was, and when I told him it was Joe, he raised an eyebrow. I explained that Samantha and I had swapped jumps with Joe and Donald. Joe had used Samantha's parachute, and Donald had used mine. Mark listened, but then shifted gears. He said, "But there's something more serious here, Robbie. You think it wasn't an accident, don't you?" I nodded. "I think someone tampered with the chute. This needs to be investigated. We need evidence." He agreed. "We're on it," he said. "You're right to be concerned. Stay here. I'll handle it." Soon the scene was filled with CSI technicians and police officers. Everyone was trying to make sense of the accident. The airfield was cordoned off while we were all questioned. Mark and his team set up a small office for statements, and we waited our turn. I watched the scene unfold from the window, feeling a knot in my stomach. There wasn't much to see. The paramedics were working on Joe's body, while others inspected the plane he'd jumped from. Rumors started to spread that Joe was still alive, but barely. I suspected the ambulance left with sirens blaring just because they were still in shock, just like everyone else. Samantha, pale and trembling, was being consoled by a policewoman. She looked so fragile, I wasn't sure how she was even standing. Eventually, she was called in to give her statement. I sat alone, feeling a mix of anxiety and helplessness. I hadn't smoked in years, but I found myself craving a cigarette, sitting in the quiet room with just a uniformed officer sitting by the door. After what felt like forever, Samantha finally came out. She was a mess, pale, red-eyed, and shaking. She looked at me and said softly, "I'm not going home, Robbie. I'll stay at the hotel for a while. Call me when you're free, okay?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Seeing her in this state made my heart ache. I walked into the committee meeting room and was introduced to Detective Robertson. He asked for my personal information, then began questioning me about the jump. He also asked about my role at the club. I told him I was the treasurer, and though they were recording the interview, he still took notes by hand. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, but I couldn't stop thinking about Joe, the fall, the malfunction, and how this might have been intentional. I was more certain than ever that someone had tampered with the parachute. This wasn't an accident. It was something far worse, and I was determined to find out the truth. Then it was Mark's turn to ask. Robbie, can you tell me about your qualifications, specifically in parachuting? I took the instructor certification course, I replied. Oh, sorry, it's the instructor certification course, Mark corrected. Right, but I've only had it a few months. I need a year's experience and my jump master qualification to become an instructor. I also have a master packer certificate for minor repairs and packing parachutes. If you want the details, they're in my journal. Mark paused, then asked, Is everything okay, Robbie? Before I could answer, Detective Kelsey softly asked, So, Mr. Lloyd, does this mean you pack parachutes? Sometimes, I said. The instructor prefers to pack his own, and I always pack mine and my wife's. I packed for Samantha a few times recently. Did you pack for her today? Kelsey asked, her gaze sharp. No, she brought it packed. I'm guessing her husband did it. You'll have to ask him. He's qualified, though he stopped coming after getting injured. Speaking of her husband, Mark began. We know, Robbie, Mark cut in quickly. Samantha told us everything. Let's focus on what you saw. I nodded and continued, explaining how I checked the time for my jump and went through my usual checklist. Jump height, wind, airspeed, etc. After that, I met Samantha. She said she needed to talk about something personal, but I wasn't sure what. What personal matter? Kelsey interrupted. I'm not sure, I said. We didn't have much privacy, but I have a guess. They didn't push it. I changed the manifest and rescheduled the jump. Samantha and I got sodas and sat down when Joe and Donald interrupted. They asked to borrow our parachutes. Are there any guest chutes left? I asked. There was a corporate event, so they didn't have time to repack. Samantha gave Joe her chute, and I gave Donald mine, knowing we had plenty of time to repack before the call. Why wasn't Joe on the static line? Kelsey asked. He was a Category 3, I said. He could pull his cord, but he shouldn't have waited that long. You need to be a Category 4 to delay 10 seconds. He sounds like a sky god, Mark added, and Kelsey raised an eyebrow. A braggart, I said. They asked a few more questions, then suddenly shifted focus. How well do you know Joseph Carpenter? Kelsey asked. Well, we're acquaintances. He works at the factory, but I don't know him well, I answered. So you're his boss? Kelsey asked. I'm part of the management team, but not his direct boss. After a pause, Kelsey asked, Did you know Joseph was having an affair with your wife? I froze. What did you say? He glanced at his notes. Apparently, they dated before and after your wedding. It ended earlier this year. Were you aware? I couldn't process it. I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself. Mark pushed a water bottle toward me. Sorry, Robbie, if you didn't know, that's a tough way to find out. But how? Why would he? I muttered, still in shock. Don't worry, Mark reassured me. I'm surprised you didn't know. He bragged to his co-workers saying his job was safe because... Why? I cut in. He said you knew and didn't care because he could meet her needs in ways you couldn't. This is ridiculous, I exploded, knocking over my chair. It's not true. Please sit down, Mr. Davis, Kelsey said, pulling up a chair for me. I fell back into it, still stunned. They asked about Abby's past, but I didn't have much to say. What mattered was our present, not her past. I didn't doubt their story, though I didn't want to believe it. The pity on their faces made me fall silent. Kelsey spoke again. We have good reason to ask. A man who was your wife's lover just fell from 1,200 meters, possibly due to a parachute malfunction, one that belonged to your good friend. I froze, realizing what he was implying. I didn't pack it, I said quickly, and I haven't touched it since Samantha got here. He was with her the whole time. Did she take it with her to the bathroom? Kelsey pressed. No, I didn't do it. Other people saw her. She was only gone a minute. It's okay, Robbie, Mark said, trying to calm me. We're just asking. Kelsey kept pressing. Why did you think it wasn't an accident? I told them about the emails Samantha had seen and how I'd suggested she contact the police, though I wasn't sure if she had. I also explained Gerald's financial situation. What would Gerald's position be if Mrs. Lloyd Smith were involved in this incident? Detective Kelsey asked. I'm not sure, I answered cautiously. Why not? Kelsey pressed. I don't know if Sammy made a will, I replied. Let's assume she didn't, Kelsey said. Then he'd be very rich, I said. Between the factory, the 3 successful carpet stores, and her father's investments, he'd inherit it all. After I gave them an estimate, Kelsey looked surprised. We moved on to questions about Gerald. I didn't hide my disdain for the man, even sharing the story about punching him. Eventually, the interrogation wrapped up. The light outside was fading, and they asked me to return to the station the next morning with other witnesses. As I stood, Kelsey added, "One more thing, Mr. Davis." I expected a Columbo-style question, but instead he asked the usual skydiver question. How can a rational person jump out of a perfectly good plane? Because the door's open, I replied. The investigation continued. As Mark said, Detective Kelsey was thorough and never rushed. A lot of suspicion fell on Samantha and me after the parachute data card was found, and it appeared to show that I had repacked it recently, just before she went home. The signature on it was mine. Samantha's husband, Gerald, confirmed that I usually packed her parachute and hadn't done it in weeks. He then suggested that Samantha and I were having an affair, and that she had blackmailed me into divorcing Abby. According to Gerald, Samantha was determined to have me, offering him a large sum of money to help her break up my marriage. He tried to warn her that I was dangerous, but she ignored him, thinking she could manipulate the situation. Samantha's refusal to listen only made things worse. But when forensic experts confirmed the handwriting on the data card wasn't mine, Gerald's version of events completely unraveled. With the focus now on Gerald, he grew increasingly desperate to avoid responsibility. When he was accused of attempting to homicide his wife to secure her wealth, he denied everything. He also denied the story about emails to a mysterious woman who was allegedly helping him plot Samantha's passing. Police seized his laptop for examination, but it was practically unused, and Gerald claimed it just needed an update. He said he had wiped the old laptop clean and donated it to a charity that helps seniors with computers. This too was true, but by the time the laptop was found, it had a new hard drive, making it useless as evidence. Unable to escape the growing suspicion, Gerald tried to shift blame back to Samantha. He admitted to a few affairs, but insisted it was because Samantha had stopped being intimate with him. He even claimed the idea of a mysterious woman offering him unlimited pleasures, as the emails suggested, was absurd. He hadn't thought about anything like that, and in fact he found the idea revolting. Despite mounting evidence that the parachute had been tampered with, the investigation stalled. It was clear that someone had tried to eliminate Samantha, but there was little progress. I admired the police's patience as they meticulously retraced their steps, calling us all in for more questioning when new details came to light. But for all their hard work, there was no sign of a breakthrough. I was living alone by then. That night, after the accident, I came home to find Abby drunk. She threw her arms around me, relieved that I was okay. Apparently, the news had reported a fatal accident at the parachute club, though they hadn't identified the sufferer. I later learned that Joe had died instantly from the fall. When the St. John men arrived at the scene, they thought they saw some movement from Joe's body. Whether from the body adjusting or gases escaping, no one could be sure. One of them attempted CPR, and according to protocol, CPR must continue until a doctor confirms end. The official verdict was that Joe was dead on arrival at the hospital, though the radio report had gotten ahead of itself. Abby didn't know who the sufferer was at the time. She asked immediately, and I simply shook my head and went to the bathroom. I told her to wait in the living room, and I'd fill her in later. When I came back, she was glued to the news on TV, watching a mobile phone clip of Joe falling. It was impossible to tell who it was, but Abby immediately recognized the distinctive parachute. "That's Samantha's," she said. I grunted in agreement, and as she turned toward me, I grabbed a glass of whiskey. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Yeah, it was Joe," I said slowly. Abby's face twisted with shock, and her voice cracked. "I didn't like her, but she didn't use it," I replied coldly. "And who then?" She hesitated before asking, "Who was it?" I looked her in the eye and answered, "It was Joe Carpenter." Her face scrunched as the realization hit her, and tears began to flow. She muttered through her sobs that Joe was a good guy, and it was all in the past. "I don't think a couple of months is that long ago, Abby," I said quietly, watching her wince. She still tried to deny it. "I don't know what you're talking about," she claimed. "It was when we worked at the factory," I replied. "It was never serious." Then, as she always did when cornered, Abby tried to turn things around. "The man just died. Can't you show some respect?" I snapped back. What kind of respect have you shown me? You think you can lie and hide everything? Stop it, I shouted, and she fell silent, finally realizing how angry I was. You slept with him and others at the factory before we even got together. I know all about it. Stop lying, witch, I growled. She stopped crying and started to change her story. She spoke about respecting the deceased, claiming that she had always loved me, and if I'd just been more confident in bed, she never would have gone back to Joe. But I wasn't interested in her excuses. The argument escalated. After I called her out, she stormed off to her sister's, but soon came back, trying to grab her favorite leather jacket. I handed her the bag I'd packed. Take this. You can come back for the rest later. What? What do you mean? She asked. I mean, it's over, I said coldly. You're in the past now. Get out of my sight before I do something we'll both regret. You can't do this, Robbie, she cried. You can't leave me like this. It's too late, I said, opening the door. I'm meeting with a lawyer tomorrow. You should do the same. For days, Abby begged me to take her back. When it became clear I wouldn't, she started threatening to destroy me. I controlled myself, told her to see my lawyer, and assured her that since the apartment was mine before the marriage, she wouldn't have much claim. Without kids and with a steady job, she wouldn't get much else. Word spread at the factory, and soon stories started coming to light about Abby's past. A supervisor and a senior foreman confirmed that she had a reputation for services, with Joe Carpenter being the primary recipient. A few others had been involved too, but Joe was the one who bragged about never needing protection. I learned that Abby had been taking Joe to the factory during lunch breaks, and if he wasn't working, she found someone else. It seemed everyone at the factory thought I was a fool for marrying her, though they kept quiet. I couldn't do anything about it, but I kept those details in my mind. Finally, after relentless work from the police, everything started to fall into place. They asked to check all the computers in the house. I handed over 2 identical laptops I had bought for us, surprised they hadn't done this sooner. After 10 days of inspection, they called me in again. That Wednesday, Detective Sergeant Mark Haley asked me to bring Samantha to the station. We arrived, and to my surprise, Abby was already there. We were told we were there to assist with the investigation, and were informed we had the right to bring a lawyer if we wanted. None of us did. The police set up the 2 laptops in front of me, asking me to identify which one was mine. It was easy. Mine had some minor scratches, including a noticeable chip on the corner from when I dropped it. I explained this without hesitation, confident in my answer. The next question was whether I'd ever used Abby's laptop. I admitted I had, but only occasionally. Sometimes I'd leave my laptop in the car, so I'd use Abby's if she wasn't on it. Just to check the news or sports scores, I explained. Inspector Kelsey asked, but not for emails? No, I always used mine for that. We shared a shopping email address, but my personal one was only on my laptop for club messages or buying gifts. The officers exchanged a look and said I could leave if I wanted, but I decided to stay. I'd prefer to stay and support Mrs. Lloyd Smith, I said. She's a bit shaken. Abby scoffed, but I ignored it. The officers agreed, but I had to sit farther away and not speak. I moved to a different chair. Kelsey handed Samantha a stack of papers. Sammy seemed detached. Abby fidgeted, clearly wanting a cigarette. I remembered the cost of cleaning my apartment after Abby's last smoke. Kelsey addressed Samantha softly. Please read these, Mrs. Lloyd Smith, and let us know if you recognize anything. Take your time. As Samantha flipped through the papers, she gasped and then sobbed. I almost stood, but they motioned for me to stay seated. After a few breaths, she regained control and kept reading, her face grim. The room was tense, the only sound the quiet hum of the recorder. After a while, Samantha looked up, her voice faint. I've seen these before. They're the emails I found on Gerald's computer. Do I need to read more? This is important, Kelsey replied. Please continue. I glanced at Abby, who was still squirming with curiosity but couldn't see what Samantha was reading. The tension was growing in her. Finally, Samantha reached the last pages, gasping and bringing one up to her face in disbelief. After a long moment, she set it down and began sobbing, tissue in hand. Abby erupted. What's going on here? Why am I sitting here while she's treated like a princess? She shouted. Kelsey's tone was calm but firm. Mrs. Lloyd Smith is reviewing emails from your computer. Emails where you and Mr. Smith plan not only an affair, but also the liquidation of his wife. Abby froze, her mouth moving soundlessly. Then, trembling, she said, This is a mistake. I stayed quiet, trying to comfort Samantha. Abby turned to me and demanded, Tell them, Robbie. I won't. Why not? She asked, her voice sharp. I don't like him. I said bluntly. Tell them, she insisted. I ignored her and kept my arm around Samantha. Abby nearly screamed. I'm not staying for this. I'm leaving. She stormed to the door, but a constable blocked her. Turning back, Kelsey said, Abigail Ruth Davis, I'm arresting you for the attempted homicide of Samantha Lloyd Smith. You have the right to remain silent. That's when Abby fainted. I could have caught her, but I didn't. It wasn't much compared to what she'd planned for Sammy. I made a half-hearted attempt, but it was too late. The following months dragged on. The investigation into Joe's passing was slow, and there was no rush to take the case to trial. I encouraged Samantha to take a break, and when she returned, she was more relaxed, though she seemed less involved in the business. I took over most of the work, with Freddie and Millicent handling the day-to-day operations. When Gerald Smith finally confessed, I thought Abby would follow, but she stuck to her story. Detective Mark admitted privately to me that he wasn't sure about her role, but he wasn't ready to make a move. I could have told him Abby was a skilled liar, but I kept quiet. She continued denying everything, despite the mounting evidence. The club was falling apart after Joe's end. Membership dwindled, and the jump schedule got slower. Samantha made one last jump, then quit. I did a few more, but it all felt different. Another club was in the process of buying equipment, and I couldn't deny that things had changed. The court was intimidating, and the prosecution walked me through the events of that day. But the hardest part was when they turned to Abby's and my relationship. I understood why Samantha had been so upset reading those emails. The first conversations were just flirting, anonymous online chats that many people probably engage in for arousal. At first, they used fake names like Mistress Hot and Wet talking to Bull G. The exchanges were about sexual fantasies they wanted to explore, but their real-life partners were reluctant. Eventually, the partners became more open, and I was asked if I knew about my wife's desires, as she had tried to convince me to try similar things. I had to admit, it was exactly what she had been pushing me to do. As time passed, they revealed their true identities. Gerald confessed he had feelings for me and was willing to explore things with Abby. However, she hesitated, worried that such a relationship would end her marriage and the lifestyle I provided. She insisted on keeping things just online for a while. But as their chats grew more explicit, their desires shifted toward more hardcore fantasies. When Abby sent a photo of herself in a leather corset and high boots, Gerald's response was almost desperate. Things escalated when they began discussing how to remove their partners from the picture to pursue their desires. Initially, it was cautious, with neither wanting to risk losing their current lives. But when Abby suggested an accident might be the answer, it took a darker turn. Though they never specified what kind of accident, it was clear they were discussing a fatal one. Abby's final message included a plan for Gerald to gain a fortune through insurance, a plan that seemed to be sealed, though there was no trace of any agreement. The day before the planned incident, Gerald messaged her, saying it would be the perfect day, and Abby reminded him to stay away from each other for 6 months afterward. During the trial, the defense wasted time questioning me, but I stuck to what I knew without wavering. My pain was clear, but I made it through unharmed. Over the next few days, I sat in court watching the prosecution lay out their case. They presented damning evidence, including emails found on Abby's computer, photos from Gerald, and timestamps matching when she was at home. But the biggest blow was Gerald's confession. The defense seemed disappointed she didn't take the chance to claim mental illness and reduce her sentence. Instead, she categorically denied everything, even trying to revive the false claim that Samantha was blackmailing me, something Gerald had admitted to fabricating. I missed the closing statements because I had a critical business meeting. Later, I learned the jury found Abby guilty. In England, a life sentence is mandatory for liquidation, and because she had planned it for financial gain, she received a 30-year minimum. Abby fainted when the sentence was announced, and days later, she became hysterical. But I wasn't there to see it. I had already told her that our relationship was over. A few months later, I was sitting on a terrace in Grasse, France, enjoying the view of Lac de Saint-Cassien, when Mark Haley, now a detective chief inspector, called me. We hadn't seen each other in nearly 8 years, but he was in Marseille on an investigation and wanted to catch up. I invited him to dinner, and we spent the evening talking about home and family. Mark asked about my life now, and I told him that Samantha and I had grown closer after the trial. It wasn't instant. It took nearly a year before we admitted there were real feelings between us. We had both been hurt before, so we were cautious. Slowly, we built something genuine. Later, after a dinner with some Japanese businessmen, Samantha made a comment that we spent more time together than most married couples. That was all it took. I held her hand, and when she looked back, I told her I liked being with her. She asked if I was sure, and when I said I was, we shared our first real kiss, a gentle, loving moment. We started dating properly after that, taking things slow. When I suggested we make it official, she agreed. And after a 6-month courtship, we got married in a small ceremony. Our honeymoon in Barbados was a bit awkward at first, but we both found our rhythm and our bond grew stronger. We talked openly about our past and the memories of what had happened, especially concerning Gerald and Abby's disturbing letters. We worked through it all, establishing what we enjoyed and what we never wanted to revisit. At dinner, I told Mark that our relationship had been slow and steady, and we were more in love than ever. He smiled and asked about my past partners, but I shrugged it off. They were history. Gerald's doing well in prison, Mark added. He's a bit institutionalized now. He's still bitter at Abby, though, and claims it was all her idea. He's upset that she's never taken responsibility. He might be up for parole soon, but I'm not sure he'll want it. I tried to interrupt, but Mark pressed on. Abby's situation is different. She had a breakdown and still denies any role in Samantha's near end. Psychologists think it's a deep denial, possibly linked to bipolar disorder. Some even suggest she has multiple personalities, and the dominant one erased memories of her actions. This means she's unlikely to get out soon. She knows admitting guilt might help, but she refuses to. That leaves us with a big question, doesn't it, Robbie? Mark paused and took another sip. What question? I asked, trying to stay casual. Mark set his glass down slowly, locking eyes with me. How did you do it, Robbie? I frowned, caught off guard. I'm sorry, what? Mark smiled slightly. I'm a cop. I may not be a detective genius, but I'm good at what I do. I take my time and I don't like sending the wrong person to jail. He leaned in. Remember Mr. Kelsey? I nodded. Well, he was all about results, quick and flashy, especially with high-profile cases. It probably got him promoted. Me? I'll never go higher than I am. But listen, Robbie, I've been chewing on something for years. When we first investigated, I felt sorry for you. You seemed clueless, like the poor husband who had no idea his wife was cheating. But I began to see it differently. You knew, didn't you? I nodded. Yes, I knew. That's why I got her the job away from the factory, hoping it would stop. But I knew it didn't. Mark's eyes narrowed. You're good, Robbie. Over time, I saw you slowly drawing Samantha in, showing her you were a better choice than her husband. A lot of guys would have just had an affair with her or used her to replace Abby. But you had bigger plans. I was silent, letting him continue. See, he said, you come from a working-class background just like me. You resented your roots, you made your money and climbed up, but you lost respect because of Abby and her lovers. But the real target was Gerald, wasn't it? I kept a neutral face, but Mark wasn't done. What bothered me most was how Gerald was convinced to go along with the plan. I knew something didn't add up, so I stalled the investigation. Kelsey hated that, of course, and kicked me out. Mark paused, then continued. It wasn't until later, when Abby still denied the letters, that I started wondering if she was the one who sent them. That's when a new thought struck me. He leaned forward. Knowing Abby, I figured she wouldn't have orchestrated something like this alone. It needed someone cold, someone calculating. Not her. And not you, either, usually. I shot back. You were never married to her. Mark smirked. True. But what if you planned this all out, step by step? What if you set up an email account on her computer, knowing she'd never find it? Used her own sexual fantasies to lure Gerald? What if you carefully crafted everything to make it look like Abby came up with the plan? He paused, watching me. Maybe you wanted him to fall for it. And when he did, you sat back, watching him board the plane with her parachute. You were cold-blooded enough to let him fall, and you kept your cool during the interrogation, knowing all eyes would be on Gerald. He continued. I also noticed something odd during the trial. You were the only one who didn't ask about Joe's condition. I thought it was because you were experienced enough to know he didn't survive. But now I think it's because you were relieved. Mark took a deep breath. If I'm right, though I can't prove it, you might be the most ruthless, calculating person I've ever known, and that says a lot considering my years of service. He fell silent, his gaze unblinking. I sighed, still keeping calm. Abby's sick, Mark. You've come up with a whole scenario based on her refusal to admit what she did. The truth is, she plotted to destroy a man in cold blood, all for her own gain. She can't accept that her schemes led to someone's passing. I gave him a hard look. You've created a good story, but I think it's just a fantasy. I don't know what else to say, except that I'd appreciate it if you didn't come here again. Just as I finished speaking, a car pulled into the driveway. Mark stood up and turned toward the vehicle. Before he got in, he turned back to me. You've probably gotten away with it, Robbie. I doubt you'll ever face consequences, unless there's some higher power out there watching. But I've got my own life, and I won't dwell on it. Honestly, I don't want to meet you again. You're the most dangerous person I've ever known, and I don't think you feel any remorse. But maybe you'll think about Abby. Maybe remember how you once felt about her. She's been punished enough, don't you think? I watched the car drive off, then turned to see Samantha waving from the window. I finished my beer slowly, contemplating his words. He was right about a lot, but wrong about one thing. Abby wasn't done being punished. The only good thing about Joe's passing was that Samantha chose to talk to me instead of jumping. I knew Joe and Donald would take our parachutes. They always did, saving money instead of paying rent, and I didn't care who took hers. I also knew things weren't going well for Donald and Malcolm. After we sold the business, they hated the new regime, and eventually, they were shown the door without ceremony. Am I dangerous? I muttered to myself. I'm just an accountant. Samantha and I used some of the money to buy the villa we now live in. We've been comfortable ever since, living off the interest. I still work from home, managing the finances of some wealthy neighbors. Just then, Samantha came into the room. Mark left? She asked. Yeah, back to England, I said with a chuckle. Good riddance, she said with a playful shudder. Anyway, the kids are napping, and I thought, she paused, then laughed. It's no use, you scoundrel. I'm going for a nap. She kissed me deeply, then walked away with a grace that made me forget about Mark or anything else in the past.